Hello everyone, my name is Praveen and I welcome you all to yet another Java topic. Today we're going to talk about Spring Config Server, how to use the config server, what is the need for config server, and what are the different ways by which you can manage your configuration outside of your Spring Boot based microservices. So when we talk about config server, we basically want to manage the properties, the property files that we have in our code, which we use for running the microservices, right? So one of the basic features that we need from our properties management component is that your properties has to be an externalized one, so that if you want to change the value of your properties, you don't necessarily need to recompile your component and deploy the new release artifact into the production environment, right? So the properties has to be decoupled from the code, basically. Now, if possible, there has to be a way to manage the operations, the edit operations, update operations, delete operations onto the property. So only the authorized person has to do those kind of operations. They have to be encrypted so that sensitive properties like passwords and all secrets should not be visible to the unauthorized person. uh, as far as possible, your properties there should be an ability to change your properties at the runtime without restarting the service, right? So we'll see how many of such features provided by your Spring Boot config server and how we can utilize it. So if you see that in a traditional Java ecosystem, how the properties are specified and how they are managed. So very simple that we have is your system properties, right? So whichever OS you are running into, you may be a Linux or maybe on Windows, that OS brings certain system properties along with it. The second thing is your environment variable. So whenever you are starting a process, user may source or export certain variables for that particular process. So for that process, those environment variables will be available for usage. Then certain variables can be passed as a program arguments, like -d arguments for a Java process. There may be a variable specified or the property specified into the properties file. Now that properties file may be present in within the class path of a service, or it may be a completely external file which may be read by the service itself, and then it parses the properties and fill it or set it as a system property. So let's see, when we go to an example, how we can specify the properties as part of config server and how we can utilize it. So what Spring config server does, it basically gives you a centralized configuration management wherein your properties has been centralized at one place, and one or more Spring Boot based microservices can utilize the properties which is there um, into your centralized location. So some of the aspects or the features of Spring Boot based microservices are properties are externalized, which means that there is a separate service which has been running to manage your properties. They are version controlled, which means that your properties are backed by a Git or the Tortoise SVN based version management tool. You can specify the environment specific properties, as in different properties for dev, different properties for SIT, different properties for UAT, different properties for production. Properties are consistent, so whoever is reading it, the changes will be reflected consistently on all the services. You can change the properties real time. You don't need to restart your service, and there is an ability to support blue green deployment as well, which means that only one service has been referring to version 1 of your property, and the another service is referring to version 2 of your properties, which means that since the properties are backed by the version control, I can run my service 1 or this version 1 on one particular branch of property, and version 2 into another branch of a property. So by that way I can maintain two different copies of my properties file, and services will be running onto two different values, right? So in a nutshell, if you see how exactly the properties are ran, so if you see this particular diagram, I have something called as config server. Config server is referring the properties from, let's say, Git, and it not only has to be a Git, it may be an SVN, or it may be a file system as well, wherein you can specify the property. And then there are different config clients or the microservices which are referring um, to the properties which has been loaded by the config server. So now let's see how we can code this particular thing, and how the config client can utilize the properties using loaded by the config server. So as you can see it here, we need two different kind of services needs to be created. One is a config client, another is a config server, and the third thing we need to do is we need some kind of a Git repository wherein we are storing our properties. Okay, so I'll go back to my IntelliJ IDEA, and let me increase the font a bit. Let me increase the font. Okay, so I think this should be properly visible. Now this is my config server project. It is nothing as of now. It's all empty. What I will do is let me create a new package for it. I say com com java fun spring config server, and let me add my main class into it as of now. So I say spring config server runner, right? So in okay, let me rename it. So in for a config server runner, we don't need to do anything. It just need to run a main class. That's it. There is no coding needed into the config server. So what I will do is in my pom.xml, I'll add certain dependencies. So the very first dependency that I need is Spring Cloud config server. Okay, Spring Cloud config server. Okay, I'll get the latest and greatest of the version which has been available. The second dependency that I would need is Spring Boot Starter Web. Okay. Third dependency that we need is Spring Security, Spring Boot Security Starter, and I'll let you know. I'll tell you why we need that. We need Spring Boot Starter Security. Okay, this should do. We don't need anything else for our Spring Boot config server. So let me re-import my project so that it will reload all the Maven dependencies that I need, and I'll go back to my Maven class. So let it reload it. Let's give it a couple of seconds for it to finish the reloading of the dependencies. I think it is reloaded now. So I need to mark it as a Spring Boot application. I think it is still reloading. Okay, it's done. And the next thing I need to do is I need to enable it to be a Spring Boot config server, right? So you just need to put a enable config server. That's it. Apart from this, we don't need to do anything else. So pretty basic. Let's just start the service. say Spring server runner dot class, pass in on the arguments. Okay, that's it. We don't need to do anything else. So let's run our service and let's see if it is coming up or not, and then we'll put certain other properties that we need for this particular service to start reading the properties file from the GitHub itself. So let it rerun for now. Okay, it's building fine. Let's run our service and then see if it is coming up or not. It might fail as of now because we haven't given any properties file to it to go and reload it. So let's see if it works or not. What we need is we need to provide certain configurations for our service to give GitHub repository details to for it to start start loading the properties from the GitHub. Okay, so right now if you see it is failing because we haven't given him a Git URL as of yet. So what I will do is I'll give bootstrap.yml at this server.port. I say 9090. Next thing I'll need is Spring Cloud config. Okay, I am into my bootstrap.yml. So I'll need to give certain Git related properties to it. So I'll give Spring cloud.config.server.get. Okay, and now if you see there are a number of properties exposed at the Git level, right? So the one of the most basic thing that we need is we need a GitHub URL to which you want to connect, right? So this is URI we need. Then we need a password and username, right, to connect to the GitHub URL. So what I will do for now is I say git dot username dollar git dot password. So that will be my Git username and my Git password. I will put it as a program argument while running this particular service. Okay, so I will not hard code it. And the next thing I need to give it is my GitHub URL. So if I go back to my Git, this is my GitHub account, and I have created a repository called as config. As of now, it has only one properties file called as application.properties. If I click on it, there is only one line in it says that hello world is hello from world. So what I will do is I'll go back to my, I need to get a Git URL for this particular repository. I can go to code and I copy this particular URL which I have for my GitHub repo and I put it into my code. So let me go back to my project. I put my URL, I'll put my username and password. So once I do that, this service should be able to uh, start picking up the properties which is there into my GitHub repo and start loading it into its own memory. Okay. So what I will do is I'll pause this as of now. I'll put my username and password as a program argument. Then we'll come back and I'll run the service. Okay. Now what we can do is I will restart my service. I have put my username and password as a program argument. Now if I restart it, it should be able to connect to my GitHub account, which is here, and with using the given username and password and load whatever the properties that I've put into my config repo. Okay, now let's see if it is coming up or not. Let's give it a couple of seconds. And the service is coming up on port 9090. And if you see here, I'm getting certain security password. I'll tell you what that is. Okay, our service is up. Now if you see here, there is one line, it says no active profile is set and falling back to default profiles. Now we'll see what is that. So before that, what we will do is we'll connect to port 9090 and try to access the properties which has been loaded by our service. So 9090. Once I do that, it is redirecting me to a login screen. So my username is admin and the password is the one which is auto generated when my service was coming up. So let me see why this is not working. Password is this, or maybe I'm missing the default username. What is there? Okay, never mind. What we will do is, and this is basically coming for us because that is coming for us because we have a Spring security in our class path. So that's why it is by default giving you a login screen. So what I will do is I don't remember the default username. So what I'll do is I'll say Spring dot security Spring security uh, user. It's like this, username and password. So I say admin. So my username and password both are admin. So let's run it again. This time we should be able to connect. Now if you notice, now this time there should not be any default password generated. Okay, service is up. Let me try to log in again. It should again redirect me to the same screen. Now I say admin. This time it should work. Now say application slash default. Now what this application slash default is, basically your service is connects to the GitHub repo, whatever you are given, and then from that it loads the properties file into your service. So since what I shown you just now is I'm not running my service with any of the profile. There is no active profile set. So it is falling back to default. So what I'm giving here is I'm giving the profile with which my service has been connected, right? So as of now, if you see, it has correctly loaded the source. The source is this one with this GitHub repo. File name is application.properties and the properties which is there is hello.world. Right now if I change the property again and put some different property into my service, it should be able to pick up that particular property again, right? So let's do that. What I'll do is I have created another project and I checked out the properties file which is there in the GitHub. Okay, so I have introduced one more property and now I'm pushing it into my GitHub repository. So what I will do is, till now we had only one property. Let's try to refresh my service again. And now if you see, I have one more property coming in into my and here I didn't restarted my service. So the moment I put it, it automatically reflected it and it picked up the property itself. Now this is our server side, right? So till that time we are only talking about the config server. So there are a couple of things that you can do with your config server is what you can do is if you want to avoid making the HTTP call every time again and again, right? So you can check out the repository into your local file system. right? So that you don't need to make that call again and again. And if the GitHub repository is down or you're not able to connect to it, you can still serve the same properties by using your local checked out repository. So for that, what you can do is, so there is something called as clone on start thing, right? So by default it is false. So I make it true as of now, and we need to give it a base directory where your repository will be cloned. So here I say I want to clone my repository at c:\temp slash config server. So once I do that, whenever my service comes up, it will clone the repository at this particular location. So let me restart my service one more time, and then we'll see if things gets cloned or not. So as of now, this directory does not exist. If you see here, it doesn't find any results, right? This directory does not exist as of now. So once the service comes up, it should check it out at this particular directory and copy the things there. So let it come up. Okay, service is started. Let's try to hit the endpoint again. It should redirect me back to my login screen. And okay, we are again back to the same thing. Now let's go and see if my repository has been cloned or not. So if you see here, c:\temp, and it is correct created just now a minute back. I checked out my thing again. So if I delete it from here, it should ideally be recreating it again one more time. Okay, and we can verify that by restarting our service. Okay, till the time it comes up, we have done with our server setup. So what I've done is we created a Git repository, we put a couple of properties into it, we connected to it, we cloned it into our local file system. Now we found out again that if the new properties has been introduced, you don't need to restart your config server, it automatically picks it up. Okay, so these are the things that we found out and validated as well as part of your config server setup. Now the next thing what we need to do is we need to see how the config client has been created and how config client can utilize the certain properties which has been loaded at the config server side. Okay, so if you see again, the config server has been created and it checked out the properties. Okay, so let me create another project called as so I'm creating a new project called as config client. It should be com java fun. Okay, this is my config client. I'll put a new package into it. Java fun dot spring.config.client. Right, let's create our new main class. This is spring config client runner. Okay, we are mostly set. What we need is we need to properties file. So I'll do bootstrap.yml. Another thing that I need is application.yml. As of now, both will be empty. Next thing is what we need is we need to add few dependencies into it. So we need Spring Cloud config. Okay. Next thing we will need is an actuator. So I'll remove it. So I need a Spring Boot starter actuator. And I'll tell you why we need an actuator basically. The next thing I need a Spring Boot starter web. I need Spring Boot starter web. Okay, so we are mostly set with our dependencies. Let me re-import it again so that all the dependencies gets loaded. Till the time, let's see what's happening with our server. Server is up cleanly this time. Now let's go back to our config client. It's not able to determine the dependency. Why? Okay, so this has to be Spring Cloud starter config. Okay, now it should be fine. Let me reload it again. And that's the only thing that we need to do. We don't need to put any annotations the way we did it for config server, right? It should be automatically picked up since it finds this starter cloud starter config into the class path. Now let's make it a Spring Boot application. Let's create a main class. Okay, good. Arguments. Okay. Now, how will we find out that our client application is basically able to read the properties from the config server or not, right? So for that, there are a couple of ways by which you can try to refer the properties file. So one of the most common way is putting the @value annotation. So what I will do as of now is I'll create an hello controller. Okay, now it has a request. This is a REST controller into request mapping. Let's say slash hello, and I create a new method inside it. Let's say string hello. Okay, and this returns certain things. So what I will do is private string hello, and its value should come from the properties file. So value should come from the properties file. So if you noticed, if you've seen our properties file, the one which we checked in, it basically has a property called as hello world, and it says its value is hello from world. So now let's see if our client is able to read this particular property or not. So once I hit this particular endpoint, it should return me back hello from world. Okay, now certain things we need to do basically is we need to give a way by which our client can talk to our config server and fetch up certain properties from it. So for that, what we need to do is we need to give a URL to which our client can connect. Okay, Spring Cloud config server, it should be like this, spring cloud config URI, and this should be the URL of your config server. So for us it is running into 9090. Okay, and you can basically connect to multiple, since if you see in YML notation, this is signifies a list of values. So since this is a list, it means you can connect to more than one config server, and then you need a username and password. Basically, because our config server has been password protected, you need to give a username and password for it to connect to. Now let's see if our service is coming up or not. This is pretty much what we need to do it for it to connect to a config server. So let it get built. It says it's running. So okay, this is coming up. So if you see, it is connecting to, oh, not 9999. I need to connect to 9090. My bad. Okay, let's restart it again. This time it should work. You should connect to 9090 and fetch or refer the properties which are there loaded by the config server. Now it is fetching the properties from the config server. This should work this time. Yep, no error came, means it is gone ahead. Profile is default again. We haven't started any particular profile. Okay. Now let me try to access this particular hello endpoint. Right, it is on 8080 slash hello. We got hello from the world, right? So this is the property which we have stored into our GitHub repo. So this is working fine for us. There is one more way by which we can refer the properties, and that is your configuration file. So second thing what I can do is I say properties configuration, let's say, and I can create the configuration for myself. So I say configuration enable configuration properties, configuration properties, I say prefix. I need to give prefix as suppose hello, right? And then this is my property, so it basically try to fetch hello.world. And what we can do is, let me generate its getters and setters. That's it. And I refer by using my configuration properties as of now. Okay, so I inject it, properties configuration, and this time rather than reading it directly from here, what I will do is I'll read it from here. So let me restart it one more time. So these are the two ways by which you can refer these particular properties as well. So let's see if it works or not. Now after doing this, we will see how you can refresh the properties at the client side on the runtime without restarting the service. And that was one of the reason why we added actuator into our class path, right? So let's see uh, how we can refresh the properties by without restarting your service. See, still working. Okay, so this time it picked up the properties from the configuration class directly. Now what I will do is I will change the text that we are having. um, so here I say change text. Okay, and I check it in, I'll push it out. Commit and push. So now we should get a changed value back from the server. Okay, now we need to make sure that after changing it, we neither restarting the config server nor we need to restart the config client. Okay, so what I will do is, since I need to make certain code changes, probably we'll change it one more time. So we are checking it from here. So what we need to do is we need to mark this particular bean as a refresh scope. So this is something which is coming to us from the actuator. So let me restart it and then let it come up, and then we'll change the that particular property one more time. So my service is coming up as of now. So if you remember the initial objectives that we talked about, that our properties has to be externalized. So in this case, where properties are externalized, there is a proper authentication in place for our properties. It has been guarded by your Spring security. The real-time update is there. So we've seen that in the case of server, we didn't restart the server. We changed the properties, and properties are getting pushed, right? And now we'll see the same thing in case of client as well. So this is coming as change text. Now what I will do is I will go here and I'll change it. Rather than change text, we say, let's say hi from world, right? And I'll push it out. Let me commit it and push it. Okay, so once this goes, we will not restart our config client, and we want to see if this new property comes or not. This has been pushed. Now let's run it again. Still the old property is coming because we haven't refreshed our bin yet. So we have missed one thing here is what we need to do is with Spring Boot 2, some of the actuator endpoints are not enabled by default. So we need to enable this particular refresh endpoint, which we can call afterwards. So what I will do is I'll go back to my client. I'll go back to application.yml and I'll enable the refresh endpoint. Okay. And let's restart the service one more time. Service is coming up. So we need to change our value of that property one more time just to make sure that it is really getting reflected or not. Okay. Now the last value that we put is hi from world, right? We'll change it one more time. Let it come up. This came up. Let's say hello. Says hi from world. I'll change it one more time. Let's say bye from world. Okay, pushing it again. Now this time we'll not be restarting our service at all. So till the time it comes up, if you are new to the channel, please do like, share and subscribe. This is the motivation for making and coming up with this kind of videos. I'm a new YouTuber, so any encouragement is highly welcome. If you have any suggestions for improving my coding style or improving the way I narrate, please put a comment onto the description box. All the suggestions are highly welcome, and please do like and share and subscribe with your peers, buddies, and all the other people who may be interested in this kind of tutorials. Okay, so this has been pushed. Let's try to access it one more time. Still saying hi from world. Now what we'll do is we'll call this refresh endpoint, and our bean will get refreshed by the actuator, and it should ideally be picking up the new values which is there onto your GitHub properties file. Okay, so what it is saying is your hello world property has been refreshed. So let me go back again and call this particular thing again. Now it says buy from world. Now you saw that with real time updation of the property, you don't even need to restart your service. Whatever properties you see which is eligible, or the beans which are eligible for refreshing the scope, you can mark it as a refresh scope, and they will get reinitialized without even restarting the service. Now the next concept that we need to see is, till the time what we have saw is how you can load the properties which are into their default profile. But Git again, once again, it gives you an ability to load the properties from the certain profiles as well. So what I will do now is I can activate a certain profile for me. Spring dot profiles. Now I just need to see spring dot act. So spring dot active profiles. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is we need to find it out how we can add the profiles, and we can read the files or read the properties from different branches in your config server. Okay, so let me run my service with a particular profile, and then we'll see how we can read properties file from a different branches of your repo. Okay, so I'll go back to my client. So let me run my service with a profile called as dev. Now what I will do is I'll add one more file, one more properties file into my config repo. So I'll go back to my repo. If you see here now, I have one more file called as application dev.properties, and the key is same, the property name is same, hello.world. The value now is value from dev profile. Okay, I have checked in this thing. Now I go back to my server. I don't need to run I don't need to restart my server. I refresh it. So this is my default profile. I don't see that value. It is still pointing to buy from world, but if I point it to a dev profile now, let's see what happens. Now if you see, it is pointing to two properties file. It is taking application.properties, but on top of it, it is putting the application dev.properties as well, and this particular value buy from world will get overwritten with this value from dev profile. So this is from a config server side. Now let's see how client can use this particular property. Now I need to restart my client because we activated the certain profile right now. So let it come up. And guys, if you like the video so far, again please subscribe to my channel. Okay, let it come up. I think so. So problem, I think it is still pointing to the default profile. So let me change it. Okay, I think it's the other way around. I think it's spring.profiles dot active. Okay, let's try. Okay, now if you see, it is going to the dev profile. And now we'll try to hit our endpoint and then see if it is picking up the correct value or not. Okay, it still didn't take effect. I think the issue is, and you should also keep this thing in mind, is whenever you are running certain things in config client, right, always put these properties into the bootstrap.yml, because in case of config client, properties are loaded before even before your beans are getting created. So whatever actions that you need to fetch, or the properties that you need to fetch from the config server, all those relevant properties has to be in the bootstrap, because the bootstrap is the one which gets loaded very first at the time of running the container, right? So I'll move it from the application.yml and put it into the bootstrap yml, and now it should be picking up the correct properties, because this is the first thing which happens even before your context start loading. So if I don't put correct profile there, it will still pick up the old values. Okay, now let's try 880 hello. Correct. Now you see the values has been fetched properly. Okay, so this is how the one of the very point that we discussed is you can do an blue green deployment, right? Your one service can run from one properties file, another service can run from another properties file, and this is how you can do it. Basically, you can activate certain profiles for your service, and then it will start loading the properties from a certain properties file. Now the last thing which has been remaining is encryption of certain properties. Now what we are doing is we are keeping our properties into plain text into our repository. Now you can have adequate authentication on top of it, but if you want to be an extra secure, what you can do is you can encrypt your properties, and then config server will automatically decrypt it for you. So the next thing that we need to see is how we can encrypt your properties and how you can decrypt it and load it as well. So the next thing that we need to see as part of our config server tutorial is how you can encrypt and decrypt a password, or how you can encrypt and decrypt properties value. Basically, since your values will be stored into plain text, it will be vulnerable for misuse. So it will be better to encrypt and decrypt the sensitive properties, and we'll see how config server can provide you this particular facility out of the box. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is for encrypting and decrypting property, we need to use some kind of a certificate for encryption. So today we're going to generate a very basic certificate, the JKS file, and we'll use that particular file for encryption and decryption of our values. So I'll go to so basically I'll generate the certificate in the same folder as that of my resources. So what I can do is I'll go to this particular directory, and I'll generate it there itself. I copy the absolute path. I go to that particular directory, and here I'll generate my um JKS certificate. So I have a command written here. What I will do is what I'm giving here is the name of my key alias and my key store file name. I'll put it here. It will ask you a bunch of questions. You just need to answer those. It will ask the password for you. Okay, say test 1 2 3 4. Come on, test 1 2 3 4. First name, say Java Fun, city Singapore, state Singapore, code is SG, yes, enter. So this should have generated the JKS file for me. So it generated within the target. I'll just copy it into my resources folder so that it will be available for me in my class path. The next thing that we need to do is we need to provide or give the same certificate to our server as well, because server and the client has to encrypt and decrypt using the same certificate. So I'll go to my Spring config server. I'll give it the same certificate. Now next thing we need to do is we need to tell Spring config server to start encrypting my okay. So we need to provide a bunch of properties here. So first thing we need to do is the location of your key store. So my location is in my class path. So I'll give it that location. Next thing is password. I give the password as test1234. Secret is same as password. I put the same thing. Okay, so this becomes my values. I need to give the same values at the client side as well. So I go to config client and I give the same values here as well. Okay, now once you do that, how you can encrypt and decrypt the value, we need to see that. So since we are using the Spring security into our class path, Spring security gives us basically it basically gives or exposes two different endpoints. One is called as encrypt, another is called as decrypt for encrypting and decrypting the property values. So since we are using Spring security and it is password protected, what it will do is it will not allow us to call that particular endpoint directly. So we need to bypass our security for these particular these two endpoints. So for that, what we will do is I'll create another class called as suppose security adapter, and this will extend web security adapter, web security configurer adapter of Spring security. So there is a configure method that and there is a configurer method which we can override. Okay, so I need to make it a Spring Bean. So I need to say it's as a configuration. Okay, now what we need to do here is we need to bypass encrypt and decrypt. So we need to ignore a couple of endpoints. So what we say here is whatever REST URL comes as decrypt and encrypt, we should ignore those. Say ignore and matchers, encrypt. So these things we can ignore. Okay, so we're pretty much set. So we'll run our config server and then we'll see if your encryption and the decryption algorithms are working properly or not. So once we establish that it is encrypting and decrypting the values properly, then we can utilize and use that values to put it into our Git config repo. So let it build and let the service come up, and then we'll try to see how we can utilize it. So what we'll do right now is we'll encrypt one of the value using the encrypt endpoint, and then we'll see how we can utilize it. So what I've done here, we have provided a JKS file for it. I put it into the JKS folder into my class path. I'm given a password and the secret for my JKS file. Its type is JKS and alias I give you while the one which I give while creating my JKS file. So we'll go back um, to my screen. What I will do is I will log in again, and then once I call this particular endpoint, it will give me a session ID as my cookie. I need to take that session ID and put it into the postman, and then when I call an encrypt endpoint, I'm encrypting a value called as test. When I do that, it will give me an encrypted value. Okay, I put a debug point here. I'll remove it. So it give me an encrypted value. If I run it again, I'll get a different value. If you see here, its value is AGB something like that. If I run it again, it should give me different values. Now this time I got AGBT. So every time you run it, you will get a different value. Now how you can utilize this particular value? So let's encrypt some other value. I say hello Java fun. I encrypt this value. I'll get it. Then I go back to my repo, and here I'll put this value whatever I copied. Right, I copied this, and what I need to do is okay, so we copied the encrypted value. What we need to do is we need to prefix it using something called as cipher, so that our config server should know that this is an encrypted value. So what I will do is I'll check it in this particular file, and then will try to see how we can get this value back from the server side. Okay, so let me push this file. So I'm pushing this particular file. So till the time this is getting pushed, what I will do is I'll go back to my client, and I will restart my client. I'll restart my server. Okay, so both the client and the server has been restarted now. So let them come up, and then we'll try to access this particular value and see whether everything is working fine or not. As we shown earlier, my client is running with the profile called as dev, and we put the value in the application dev properties only. So this is my server which has been coming up. Let me try to access it. Okay, so value we are getting it fine. We should get this particular thing back from the server side. So here I say application/dev. Here you see we are seeing the decrypted value already. That is on the server side. We need to see the same value onto the client side as well. So let's see if our client service has been up or not. My client service is up. Now I call my endpoint. So that should be tat/hello. The hello Java fun back. So your value has been decrypted automatically, and by this way you can guard your sensitive values as well. Okay, so this is around basically encrypt and decrypting the values. The only last point which has been left is how you can manage your property from the file system itself. So here we have used the Git as your configuration repo, but if you want, you can use the normal file system as well. So for that, what you can do is uh, you can store your property into the file system itself. So here I say I'll start with something called as native. So native is the one which is talking to your file system itself, and then you need to give a file system directory. Okay, so I need to say native, and now I need to give a folder location. So there's a property called a search location. Is a location where you want config server to load properties from. So this should be a file protocol, say test dot, or I say application dot properties. Okay, and we expect a property like only one property we expect, hello world. So I'll put this property into my temp location. So I'll go to c:temp, and here I'll create another file called as application dot property. Hello from native file system. Okay, I'll save it. Okay, now what you need to do is you need to run your service with the native profile if you want to utilize the native file system. So I'll run it for now. Spring profiles native, run it again. This should be active profile, so this should be native, and now it should load the properties from the properties file. Let it come up. Now it picked up the profile correctly. I'll restart my client as well. Okay, I have disabled the dev profile right now in my client service. I restart my service again. Now this time it should be picking up the files properly. So let it come up, and this should be the end of our tutorial. If you have liked the video, like the narration, basically if you've seen the other videos as well in my channel, I try to go in depth and try to cover as much features as possible for any particular topic that I choose. So in this scenario as well, it is not really a POC or a hello world kind of an example. I try to go and explain you almost all the topics which is there in case of Spring Cloud Config Server. So if you liked it, please subscribe to my channel. So let's try to run it again. This time we are getting hello from native file system. So you may not be using it as such. You may most likely be using SVN or Git, but this is one of the example again that this is how you can utilize the Spring Cloud Config Server as well. So this brings us to the end of our tutorial. Again, please do like, share and subscribe, and stay tuned for a lot more videos coming to this particular channel. Thank you so much.